1 Kings chapter 19. After Elijah slaughtered the 450 prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel, Ahab reported the news to Jezebel, who set out to murder Elijah. So Elijah fled south of the Promised Land, below the territory of Judah, and spent the night under a broom tree where he asked God to take his life. An angel then appeared to him in the night, brought him food, and told him to eat because he had a long journey ahead of him. After eating, he journeyed for 40 nights and 40 days in the strength of that food to Mount Horeb, which was called the mountain of God. Elijah stayed in a cave at Mount Horeb, and one day God's voice spoke to Elijah and asked, "What are you doing here?" He told the Lord that he had fled because the people rejected God, and he was the only faithful prophet left in Israel. God sent a strong wind which broke the rocks of the mountain into pieces, but the text says that the Lord was not in the wind. Next, God sent an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. Next, God sent a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. Finally, Elijah heard the sound of a low whisper, and God asked him again, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah responded exactly as he had before, and God told him to return to Israel and anoint Hazael to be king of Syria, Jehu to be king of Israel, and Elisha to be a replacement prophet of God, because God's judgment of the wicked would come by these three men. And to reassure Elijah that he wasn't alone, God told him that there were still 7,000 men in Israel who were still faithful to the Lord and hadn't worshipped Baal. As the Lord instructed, Elijah found a man called Elijah and had him to follow him. At that time, Elijah was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen in the field. He cooked the oxen using the wood of the yokes, ate the meat with his family and his friends, and then he set off to follow Elijah. Something that we can learn from Elijah's encounter with God on the mountain is that God doesn't always work through noticeable manifestations of power. God wasn't present in the displays of great power on the mountain, through the wind, earthquake, and fire, but instead God was heard in the low whisper. Sometimes it's the case that the only time we acknowledge God working is when we see what we deem to be significant outworkings of his power. Great preachers, big revivals, positive cultural uprising. And though God does work through these things, as he showed Elijah on Mount Carmel, that doesn't mean that he isn't working through the times that we don't observe him. God is at work in the silent places of the world. He has servants everywhere, even if you don't know about them, just as he has 7,000 that Elijah wasn't aware of. He's working in hearts and the homes through low whispers and building faith in invisible ways. There is no reason for despair. God bless you. 1 Kings chapter 20. Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, and a group of 32 kings attacked Samaria. Ben-Hadad sent messengers to Ahab, claiming all of Ahab's possession as his own, and Ahab agreed. But then later on, Ben-Hadad tells Ahab that he was sending men into Samaria to plunder the city and take anything that they wanted. And Ahab summoned the elders and basically told them that this guy's causing trouble. Like, I already told him that I would give him all my stuff, and now he's asking for more. And the elders told him not to give in to any more of his demands. So Ben-Hadad got his men ready to attack. God spoke through a prophet, promising to give Ahab victory, even though his army was significantly smaller. And Ahab instigated the battle when Ben-Hadad and his allies were drinking. They defeated Ben-Hadad's men, but the king escaped on a horse. But a prophet of God warned Ahab that the Syrians would return in the spring. Ben-Hadad's advisors told him that they lost because the Israelite God was a God of the hills, and that he should rebuild his army and fight in the plain next time. Ben-Hadad did as instructed and brought his new army to Israel in the spring. The Syrians filled the country, but the Israelites were like two little flocks of goats. But God's prophet told Ahab that Israel would be victorious, that God was going to prove his lordship extended well beyond the hills of Samaria. Israel slaughtered 100,000 Syrians, and 27,000 more were slaughtered when the walls of Aphek fell on them. And after the battle, Ahab let Ben-Hadad live, and he made a covenant with him and sent him home. After this, a prophet of God tells a man to strike him because the Lord commanded it. And when the man refused, the prophet told the man that he would be killed by a lion for disobeying God. And it happened. The prophet then found another man and repeated the instruction. And this time, the man struck him and injured him. And the wounded prophet bandaged his eyes and sat in the road, waiting for King Ahab to come by. And when the king arrived, the prophet pretended that he was a man who had been entrusted with guarding another man at the risk of his life, but that he had failed his job. The man that he was supposed to be guarding had escaped, and Ahab told him that he deserved to die. But then the prophet took off his bandage and announced a condemnation on the king. God had entrusted Ahab with destroying Ben-Hadad, but since Ahab had failed and let him go and made a covenant with him, God was going to require Ahab's life as punishment. Now, what we learn in this chapter is that we are not in a position to extend grace and pardon to the enemies of God. Ahab shouldn't have extended grace or pardon to Ben-Hadad, and unfortunately, many Christians promote a message of tolerance and acceptance, excusing and justifying people who live in rebellion to the word of God. Those who reject God's instructions and blaspheme him are enemies of God. In Romans 5 verses 10, the Apostle Paul refers to unsaved sinners as enemies of God. If when we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? Enemies of God will face his judgment, and the last thing we want to be found doing is supporting the one whose God's judgment is going to fall on. Romans chapter 1 verse 32 states, although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. As Christians, we have to be very careful of tolerating, excusing, and justifying people who live in rebellion to the word of God. People who reject God's instructions and blaspheme him are simply enemies of God, and we're not supposed to be found supporting them, lest we be judged alongside them. God bless you.